Good. So, Natalie, you're on the spotlight. I think we can go.
I can go. All right. Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome to the second presentation of WMEA's sixth annual conference. I'm Natalie Sarrazin, Executive Director of WMEA, and I welcome you on behalf of the organization. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the incredible work done by our President, Ritesh Kogar, Secretary Rupika Bhatia, and the hard work of our social media team, led by Amit Raj Kashyap, and the workers Ashish Karkata, Jasper Levy, Pem Keshak, Vaibhav Singh, Purvi Sharma, and our editor Priya Chaturvedi. I'd also like to give special thanks to our immediate past president, Anjali Mata, for all of her hard work and dedication to the organization. We have so many more excellent speakers coming up for the next 2 weeks. I'm hoping you'll be able to join us. Tomorrow we have Tim Palmer discussing the professionalizing music education. And Thursday I'll be conducting an interview with Bollywood composer Ehsan Noorani. Before we begin today, I'd like you to hear a word from one of our sponsors, the Australian Institute of Music, who is supporting us as an associate sponsor this year. AIM has also committed multiple workshops with us in 2021. We have 3 workshops scheduled for January with them on the topics of contemporary music, music production and composition, and classical performance, conducted by 3 senior faculty. And we'll have details to you about this next week. So let's hear a word from them. Okay. All right, and now I'd like to introduce a colleague and good friend of mine, Scott Horsington, who will be doing today's talk. Mr. Horsington holds a Bachelor of Music from SUNY Fredonia, Master of Music in Music Performance from Arizona State University, and has a Master's in Public Administration and Nonprofit Management. Mr. Horsington also works at the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra as an administrator, where he acts as a liaison between the RPO staff, volunteers, and the Philharmonic League Board. Scott has spent his life teaching music and has been working at SUNY Brockport since 2012, teaching music theory, introduction to music, world music. He's a conductor of the Brockport College Community Orchestra and Concert Band. He was an accompanist for the dance program at Brockport, playing in live dance studios, improvising and developing sounds to match the students' movements. He won't tell you, but he's an award-winning diver and a student of Vinyasa Yoga. So, welcome to Scott Horsington.
Hi, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and we are ready to go. So today I'm talking about teaching voice leading through keyboard style. What the heck does that mean? So what exactly is 4-part harmony? We need to start with that. Let me back up here. There we go. So what is 4-part harmony? This is that's an exercise used in Western music theory that teaches students about writing harmony. And it involves composing 4 independent voices. So you have a soprano, an alto, a tenor, and a bass. And the goal is to move these 4 voices through a harmonic progression. There's a ton of rules to do this. You have to make sure that each voice stays within a specified range, that it stays within a certain distance of the other voices. The voices can never cross places. So for example, the soprano has to always remain on top. And additionally, as each voice moves, there are constraints about how it can move in relation to the other voices. On top of that, students are taught to avoid what they call illegal parallels, where 2 voices move the same distance, the same amount of interval space. These are typically octaves and fifths. So if you find all of these rules overwhelming, you're right. It's very overwhelming, especially for younger music students. Natalie mentioned in my introduction that I used to accompany dance classes. And when I tell people that, they say, oh, you're a pianist. And I have to say, no, I'm not. I can't really claim that I'm a pianist, but I do know how to play chords. And I found from that experience that knowing how to play various chords, being able to improvise progressions from those chords, that's taught me a lot more about how harmony works than four-part writing. So what is keyboard style? Keyboard style, pretty simply, it's a method for realizing harmonies that involves playing a full chord in the right hand and a single note in the left hand. And as harmonies progress from one chord to the next, we're looking at how to stack those chords so that the least amount of movement necessary occurs. And this is an alternative to this traditional four-part Western harmony writing because it's easier to understand. It also helps build basic keyboard skills, and it's a great foundation for songwriting and for improvisation. Just to show you a little comparison, let me back up one slide here. Let me, there we go. So to hear this progression that's notated here in four voice harmony would sound like this. And if we rewrite it in keyboard style, you can see it looks a little different. There are 3 notes in the right hand now and only 1 in the left hand. It sounds almost the same, but it's a lot easier to play. So I had some motivating questions behind this in case you're wondering, why would we stray from this traditional method of teaching harmony? So first, I obviously come from a background of what we would call Western classical tradition. And taking that background and coming to a university like Brockport, where we don't have that same kind of music program, I found myself wondering, how can I expect the same level of understanding from students who aren't participating in music in the same way you would be if you're pursuing a music degree? So from that, I started wondering, like, how necessary is music theory for literacy? And I think it depends on, your goals and your training. I can only speak to my own experience, of course, but I never really used a lot of what I learned in theory as far as, all of these binding rules that we have, except to teach it. So if the knowledge is only necessary to teach the course, then is it really that necessary at all to understand music? So in my second semester theory class, we focus on building chord progressions, writing melodies, and composing short pieces. And while some of that has a foundation in these traditional rules of 4-part writing, I found that it's mostly useless for contemporary students, and especially for those who are not pursuing a music degree. So if that's the case, what's the point of a contemporary music theory class? And I think it should be to give people enough technical knowledge to understand how music works and use those skills to their own end. Additional motivating questions, since we're talking about 4-part writing, I find myself regularly asking the question, who cares? Who cares about writing in 4 parts? I personally believe that theory is a useful tool for any musician, whether you have this Western classical training or not. But one of the most difficult exercises for students is this 4-part writing. For many, it's the reason that they choose to quit music, because it's so difficult. I think it doesn't really yield any satisfying results either, and it's not really anything you can apply in any other way as a musician. It seems to also to be geared towards the musically literate. Like, you have to know all of these other things before you can even tackle 4-part writing. And if that's the case, how useful is it? The logic behind it is that it's supposed to teach you to understand harmony, but to me, it seems like the only reason we even do it is because that's what we've always done. We now have to ask the question of, if this is something we've just always done because we've always done it, then, like, how relevant is it really? It makes sense that we would find 4-part writing used so heavily because if the practice likely developed from medieval music, Christian hymn writing, things like that, where we have 4 individual voices moving. Makes sense as a teaching tool if that is the music you have available to you at the time. So for the people who started using this system, it was contemporary to them and culturally relevant. People always use the tools they have available to teach from. And if that's the case, then I can make the argument that we should be teaching music and music theory with contemporary musical styles, or in other words, pop music. We don't have to rely on these old traditions of four-part writing. So let's consider what's in a typical pop ensemble. You've got drums, keeping musical time. You've got the bass, laying the foundation for harmony. You have a lead guitar or a lead vocalist who's singing the melody. And then in the middle, you have one or two instruments filling out all these harmonies, usually a rhythm guitar and a keyboard. So in this context, harmony is not divided among four voices. It's not soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. We've got a single instrument providing all the harmonic information we need that the other two parts, the bass and the melody, can move around. So now the question, what is keyboard style? As I mentioned before, we're straying away from this four-part writing of having two voices down below and two above, and putting all three upper voices together in the right hand of the treble staff. So this was originally sort of developed by Nadia Boulanger at the Paris Conservatory. Where it started was this extensive figured bass method for the keyboard. So it had a similar end goal of teaching students how to voice lead using the piano, but it required a pretty high degree of pre-existing keyboard technique and a lot of explanation, which can be limiting for newer students. And we're trying to get away from this additional barrier to understanding by making things more simple. On top of that, it was really designed for understanding figured bass, which is also a practice that for modern music students is not really relevant. So my interpretation of keyboard style and what I'll show you today, and this is based in a similar ideology as what Boulanger came up with, but it's much more simplified for the, let's say, modern music student. Why do we want to do this? Obviously, I've been explaining how I think that four-part writing is not necessarily the most useful thing, but really the main reason is that this connects what we're trying to do with harmony to pop music, which is what most people are listening today. It also helps to build keyboard skill without needing like formal lessons or formal classical training. On top of that, it provides a sort of a real application of harmony because students feel it in the hands. It's tactile, it's concrete. They can see the notes in front of them. They can see how their hands need to move in order to play these things. With traditional four-part harmony, if you're looking at all four parts, where you've got two in the bass staff and two in the treble staff, it becomes very difficult to try to figure out how to play that. One of the main thrusts or themes I like to promote with keyboard style when I'm teaching it is that we're trying to make this smooth. We're trying to make our progression from one chord to the next as smooth as possible. And by putting it in the hands, a student can really understand what that means. What does it mean to be smooth? What does it mean to move just a little bit at a time? That's the easiest way to get from one chord to the next. This kind of flies in the face of the original purpose of four-part writing, where you're trying to create these four unique independent melodies. But again, we're not really particularly interested in that. And I find that students struggle with all of the rules they have to manage in doing four-part writing. So by reframing that task as keeping this simple and building a skill that you can use, playing the piano, we find that we're eliminating all these discussions about the complicated rules and the individual voices, and the students can gain competency and be successful at the task. On top of that, we find that it's a lot easier to understand what's happening between our upper voices. I had some animations here that are not quite working, but that's okay. Oh. I apologize. These three slides were supposed to have some multiple examples that were supposed to show up, but they're not showing up, unfortunately. So we'll make do. So in traditional four-part writing, we find that there is a lot of distance between the four voices. We have two in the bottom, two in the top, with a lot of space in between. And that makes it difficult to compare how voices move. But by using keyboard style, because we've sort of crammed a variety of notes into the top staff, it's a lot easier to see how things are moving in relation to each other. It also makes sense that we're putting the bass by itself in the left hand because the bass tends to move sort of more independently from the other voices. And what you can see here, it's hard to, again, difficult to see because my animation did not work, unfortunately, but these red lines tracing these two individual parts. Originally, this middle part of was down here in the bass staff. So to compare that tenor part that was seen in the bass staff to the alto part in the treble staff above that, there's this visual space of the ledger in between, and often students will miss that because they see a white space, they think there's no relationship there. So by putting all three parts up into the right hand as we have here, it's a lot easier to see what's going on or what should be happening or how these can move in comparison to each other. Another reason to use keyboard style is it becomes a lot easier to see a full chord. Again, spread out in 4 parts, we've got a variety of notes that we then have to bring together to try to figure out what the chord is. But by putting them all together in one staff, we can right away say, here are my 3 notes, here is the chord that I'm dealing with. And again, the point of this is all in service to trying to understand harmonically what's happening as easily as possible. And I think one of the biggest reasons that I like to use this method is because it makes the piano a little bit more like a guitar in the sense that it becomes more easily and immediately accessible without having to have any formal training. So if you pick up a guitar, it's really easy to learn 3 or 4 chords and play a song and sing along. And the piano often doesn't enjoy that same accessibility, partly because of classical music tradition and formal training. And we find that you need a lot more of under the hood knowledge, let's say, to be able to play the keyboard. With keyboard style, you really only need to know a couple things: how to build chords, how to voice them correctly in the hands. And once you've done that, you can enjoy that immediate accessibility that an instrument like the guitar has. So before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I mentioned that I teach this particular technique in my 2nd semester theory course. Reason being, there is some preparatory knowledge that students need to have in order to successfully do this. What I typically call my theory 1 knowledge, things that they learn in their 1st semester of theory. And this involves things like scales, keys, being able to build triads, 7th chords, looking at a pop chord symbol and understanding what it means, and also doing some Roman numeral analysis. Now, I have the benefit of teaching in a piano lab, so as I'm having my students learn these things, I'll also have them play them on the piano so that they can figure out how to build it. So sort of our last jumping off point is being able to build chords, but also being able to build them with one hand on the piano. Once they can do that, it becomes much easier to get into this keyboard style. So the first step to this process, assuming students have some ability to build chords and understand chord structures, we start with 2 chords only. We don't even write it in notation. We simply write letter names on paper. And we'll take 2 chords that don't have to be related in any particular way. Once we've got our 2 chords stacked, you can see here on the left, we have a C major chord of C, E, G, and a G major chord of G, B, D. We simply trace lines to find the shortest distance. And the steps for that is first to find the common tone, as you can see here in the red arrow from G to G. We locate any half steps that exist between the chords, which here is marked by the blue arrow between C and B. And then whatever's left over, we resolve, which in this case is E and D with the green arrow. After we've figured out the pathways, we then rewrite the 2nd chord, seen over here on the right, to sort of uncross our wires. And this shows how the 2nd chord should be stacked so that from the 1st chord to the 2nd chord, we're moving the shortest distance possible. After we get some facility with that step, we start writing it in notation. So here I have the same 2 chords. You can see on the left, we've got our C major chord and our G major chord. And in order for me or a student to play those chords notated that way, I have to physically pick up my hand and move it to the other chord. Once we've reorganized it, like you can see on the right here, there's much less distance to move. I really only need to move 2 fingers, 1 key each, in order to play that pattern. And that's really where it take my chords and make them move as smoothly as possible so that I could play it in one hand without having to move all over the keyboard. Once we figured that out, we can expand on that discovery a little bit to find that certain notes always move in certain ways from one chord to the next. So in the upper left corner, I have the same progression we just saw. After that, we start changing the stacking or the ordering of the first chord, which here is the C major chord, to see how that impacts the stacking of the second chord. So I've got a few variations here. And in each, I have the same colored arrows I had on our first handwritten portion. So we can see that in all 4 examples, the red arrow is between the same 2 notes, G and G. The common tone is always moving to a common tone. Our half steps between C and B, marked by the blue arrow, always appearing in the same relationship. C is always moving to B in all 4 examples. And our last one, E to D with the green arrow, always moving from E to D in all 4 examples. So what this illustrates to students is it doesn't really matter how we stack the first chord. If we follow the process of identifying the simplest movement from one chord to the next, we'll always end up with the same result. Big challenge students face when they're doing 4-part writing is trying to figure out who should sing what note based on how that first chord is stacked. And oftentimes, because there are so many rules to follow, they kind of give up and just start plugging notes here and there. But by showing it in this form, in some way that they can feel in their hand, it becomes more obvious what they need to do, how they need to simplify the process, and also not have to think about all of these rules. What we find after we've experimented with this process for some time is that certain patterns start to arise, and we rely on these patterns to simplify our process. We base these patterns on how far apart the roots of 2 particular chords might be. So in this example, I have a C major chord and a D minor chord, and their roots, C and D, are a second apart, what we would call a second in Western interval relationships. With roots that are a second apart, we find that all 3 voices, in order to move the shortest distance, simply move by step in the same direction. So here all 3 voices are moving up by step to the D minor chord. For triads with roots a third apart, we'll find that between the 2 chords, there are 2 common tones or 2 notes that show up in both chords equally. So here I have a C major chord and an A minor chord. And if I follow this same process of restacking for the simplest movement, you can see that in the second example, the chords are almost exactly the same except for 1 single note in the top part that has to move by step. So again, we've simplified the process of moving from one chord to the next. Lastly, for triads with roots a fourth apart, in this case C major, and F major, we find that when we restack the second chord, we again have 1 common tone, and the other 2 voices move only 1 note up. Again, the purpose of all 3 of these is to simplify the process of part writing into 3 simple rules. If the roots move by second, what do we do? If the roots move by a third, what do we do? If they move by a fourth, what do we do? And so the students don't have to worry about what needs to go where. They can solve it in a very simple way. After we've built some experience with moving from one chord to the next in the simplest form possible, we start adding a bass note in the left hand. This is where we also start to bring in the technical terms for inversion. So even though in an earlier example, we looked at all these different chord stackings, I never referred to them as inverted chords. Reason for that is I want to drive home the point that when we add this bass note in the left hand, that this is really the thing that determines our inversion. Additionally, by adding a single note in the left hand, just one bass note, it makes it a lot easier for students to play the progressions that they're creating because they're making the movement simple for the right hand by making the chords as smooth as possible. And they only have to worry about one note in the left hand. This goes back to, if we look at a hymn written in 4 voices, that's much more challenging to play because both hands need to do a lot of movement. After we've added this bass note, we take our 3 rules, our 3 simple rules of how we move depending on the root interval, and we make it a little more complex, but still rooted in the same idea of coming up with predetermined patterns based on how certain notes move, so that we don't have to think about what we're doing. We can just plug in the notes and have it create our smoothest pathway possible. Similar to what I mentioned before about Nadia Boulanger's keyboard method, this is all about coming up with cells of information or chunks of information that simply get plugged in instead of having to make decisions about how do I move 4 individual voices. One of the reasons we do this, or one of the benefits that I find from this is, how do I want to say this? I think I've said it, so I will move on from here. But one of the benefits is that you don't really have to think that much about it, where students tend to have to think far too much about 4-part writing. So again, we look at how the roots of the chords move, and depending on how the roots of the chords move, we decide automatically what needs to happen. So again, we look at triads with roots a second apart. Whenever we see triads with roots a second apart, we'll always move our 3 upper voices in the opposite direction of the bass. So in my first example of a C major chord to a D minor chord, I have my bass moving up from C to D. So I take my 3 upper parts and I move them down. This is a little bit different than our process from before, and the reason for this is to try to keep our chords in the right hand over the course of a progression from drifting too far up or too far down. In my second example on the right, I have a C major chord to a B diminished chord, and you can see that as the bass steps down from C to B, the right hand is moving away from it, contrary. So for a student playing this, they can visually see that their hands are moving away from each other or towards each other. So they really get this, they really can understand the movements that they're trying to imitate. And anytime they see 2 chords with roots a second apart, they know exactly how their hands will need to move. Again, we find with triads that have roots a third apart, again, we're only moving 1 note in the top hand. So you can see in my first example, C major to E minor. I've restacked my E minor chord so that only 1 note needs to change, while the left hand moves up. So similar to what we just looked at with triads a second apart, we find that the hands are moving in opposition to each other, either towards, in my first example, or away from each other, like you can see in the second example of C major to A minor. Now, regardless of what the chords happen to be, I know I'm using mostly C chords here. Once we identify how much those 2 bottom notes in the bass move, we know exactly how the upper voices need to move. And again, students can see it in their hands, so they really get a sense of what needs to go where. For our last example of triads with roots a fourth apart, we have 3 possible variations. And we use these to eliminate what I call vocal drift. This is something I referred to earlier, but not by name, where when we're using this process of moving the chords as simply as possible without much complexity, we find that they tend to creep up over time or creep down over time. So students have these multiple options available to them to kind of mix up how the chords move within some limitations so that if the voices are creeping up, we can kind of bring them back down and corral them back to something that's playable in the right hand. So for triads with the roots a fourth apart, again, we find that there's that one note that is shared, that one common tone, and the other two voices simply move up a note or down a note. So my first example, we've got C major to F major. We can see the left hand at the same time moving through the roots. We find that the hands are now moving in the same direction as each other. We can also see that in the second example of C major to G major. Whereas my left hand's moving this way, the right hand is also following it. Our second option for triads with roots a fourth apart is similar to what we've seen with roots a second apart and roots a third apart, where the hands are moving in opposition to each other. And again, we take the three upper parts and we move them the shortest distance possible to get to where they need to go. For my first example and for my second example. And again, I'm seeing this concept of my hands moving either towards each other or away from each other. By this point, most students have kind of figured out, okay, I know my hands are either going to move one direction or the other direction. And as they get used to seeing that and feeling that, it becomes a lot easier to negotiate all of these different patterns that might come up. Excuse me. Our last option with triads, a root a fourth apart, is something called a tertian leap, where when we're looking at our chord in the right hand, we identify the third of the chord, the middle note of the chord. And whatever note that's on, it moves to the third in the next chord. This is a little bit more complicated, I find, but it's useful in the way that I teach it for students. It's useful to them, again, to avoid this drifting of the voices where they move up or down too much. You can see here that we're using it to convert our chords from a closer stacking to something a little farther apart. So it's just another option that students have if they want it. So we've got something like in our first example, where the voices spread out a little bit more, or in our next example, where the voices are spread out and we bring them back together. Before I address this, to kind of sum up what we've looked at, we've basically taken three possible ways that a root can move: by a second, a third, and a fourth. And we've said, if it moves by second, do exactly this process. If it moves by a third, do exactly this process. And if it moves by a fourth, do exactly this other process. So now we've got three rules only to address all these possible ways that we could write a chord progression. Whereas if we were trying to do it in standard four-part harmony, we're wrestling with, I have four notes and they all need to move in specific ways and they need to follow all these rules. And it's just so overwhelming for students that it almost serves no purpose. And as I've mentioned before, I kind of feel like it gets in the way of students actually learning anything about chord progressions. One thing I'd like to note, we've talked about seconds, thirds, and fourths. There are also intervals of fifths, sixths, and sevenths. We haven't talked about that. What we do in this situation is we treat them like seconds, thirds, and fourths. Fifths and fourths are inversions of each other. So if I have a fourth and flip it over, it becomes a fifth. If I have a sixth and flip it over, it becomes a third. And if I have a seventh and flip it over, it becomes a second. So since fifths, sixths, and sevenths are the same as seconds, thirds, and fourths, we treat them the same. So now we've taken these three rules and we've applied it a little bit more universally to a variety of root movements instead of only three. As you can see here in my first example, I've got, again, C major to D minor, following the rules that I've already established for it. If it moves by second, move the hands in opposition. Over on the right, we've written the same progression. We've just changed our C up to D, or our interval of a second. We flipped it over so that it's C moving down to D, or a seventh. So again, we find sevenths and seconds are the same. So our upper voices are moving in the same way in both examples. All we've really changed is how the bass moves. As I mentioned before, adding this bass note allows us to address inversions. I find this really helpful for students as well because they often struggle with trying to figure out what is the inversion of this chord. As you can see in this example, I've got the same chord, a C major chord, and all I've changed in each example is the note in the left hand. The right hand is essentially unchanged for all three, while the bass is moving. So this becomes a useful demonstration for students to show them that, like, if you're trying to figure out the inversion of your chord, don't worry about your right hand. We've already got our three rules for the right hand. Don't think about it. Just look at what that one note in the left hand is doing. Okay, so students go through this process. They usually take about a unit from a semester, which is 3 to 4 weeks, to give them some experience with these rules, with the writing out of notes in letter names and uncrossing our wires, and then boiling it down to these three rules of seconds, thirds, and fourths. Once we've done that, they can use that set of techniques to address any kind of chord progression they want. For seventh chords, the process is the same. We've added a fourth note, but we're still looking for what's the shortest distance that these notes can move from one chord to the next. If we're looking at altered or borrowed chords, or chords that don't show up in a particular key, again, it's the same process because we're not really worried about all of these old traditional four-part harmony rules. We're just interested in how can I move this the shortest distance? And we determine that simply by looking at how the bass is moving. This is also useful for teaching students about modulation because we, again, don't have to get sort of muddled up looking at these complicated four-voice chorales or four-voice hymns trying to figure out what's going on. We can see the chord compactly written in the right hand. We can play that progression to listen to how it changes. So it becomes much more accessible for students to understand how chords operate together, but also how they can veer off into other directions. What I'd like to do now is give you a little demonstration of how this can be applied to a pop song. Again, my whole point in using this method with my students is to give them something they can use with the music that they listen to, rather than being so focused on music that's been written hundreds of years ago. So we got 4 steps to this. The first is to find a song with chord symbols or lead sheets. This is easy to do if you hop on a search engine on the internet and look up the chords to a song that you like. We take those chords and convert it into notation. We don't worry about how they're stacked, we just convert it. We write our bass line, which you know is only one note in the left hand, which is also relatively easy to do. Then we just restack those chords in the right hand so that it's easy to play. So for this example, I'm using a song called, this is misspelled unfortunately, We Were on Fire by Karen Ann, written in 2011. And I have the chord symbols written down here. Let me play this for you so you can hear what we're looking at.
I've never seen you clear before, never heard you cry. My blinded heart is washed ashore, my innocence gone dry. And I wish I had more patience, there are things I can't reverse. I don't know why you were so threatened by the entire universe. You were on fire, tainted in the sun. You ran against the raging wind, decadent and drunken with desire.
So a student might say, I like this song, I would like to learn how to play it. And they go online and they find the chords, which is exactly what I've done here. So our second step, using what we've already learned in our first semester theory course, we build the chords from the chord symbols. And in my second row, after we've built up our chords using the knowledge we already have, we simply add a bass line. Again, this is based on the knowledge that they have already picked up from reading chord symbols. So now we get something a little more fleshed out. Then we apply all of these rules we've been talking about how the bass is moving and how that determines our right hand chords to be stacked. And what we end up with in the right hand after restacking them is a chord progression that's much easier to play, so that we can move through the chords that we found online in a way that is easily accessible, that we might not have been able to do if somebody handed us real sheet music, or handed us a complicated arrangement, or handed us a complicated 4-voice hymn moving through these same chords. And again, driving the point home that because the students are only looking at how the bass moves, once they identify how that bass moves, they know exactly how they need to stack each chord, or how they need to move the upper parts. From there, if we want to expand on this, which is usually what I do, because I find that this is, again, building their keyboard skills and giving them something they can use in, let's say, real life, we talk about texture. And we typically, in 4-part writing, when you're talking about texture, it becomes this process of making one of the voice parts, the top voice part, more complicated, and then trying to make another voice part more complicated, and then the next one, and then the next one. But when they're trying to make these parts all complicated, they are still having to watch out for all of these limiting rules. So we throw all that out the window and say, here are a series of common patterns you might find if you're listening to a song. If you think about a pop song, generally speaking, they've got their set chord progression, and they simply vary each chord by rhythm, either the rhythm that it's being played in or the rhythm of a beat behind it. So we take that same idea of, let's just make these chords into a rhythm. So here I've got a simple chord, a C major chord, and a variety of ways that someone might play it. Or something like, so I give students just a few brief examples and emphasize to them that they're really only limited by their imagination of how they want to break up their chords. So here we have the same example. We found the chords on the internet. We notated them. We restructured them so that they're as easy to play as possible. And then all we've done is added some rhythm to make this texture. It'd help if I played the right notes. If I was playing that in a practice room and somebody walked by, they might think, oh, that's a song. You're playing a song. And yes, it is from a song, but really all I've done is created a chord progression that's easy to play and gave it a little bit of rhythm. And that's really sort of the end goal of all of this, is giving students this toolkit that they can use to learn the songs that they like, or to even write their own. But from there, I usually go into writing a little bit of melody. Here we go. I rely a little bit more on some of the more traditional rules, but I also like to give my students some scientific background on research determining kind of what makes a good melody. We also digress into learning about non-chord tones, or how to add notes to a melody that don't belong in the chord underneath. And again, all of this is so that they can either accompany themselves singing, or they can write a chord progression like we just looked at, and write a melody for an instrument to play along with it. So in the end, we end up sort of in the same place that we might end up with 4-part writing, of creating compositions, creating a harmonic progression that has a melody that goes along with it, but we're not so wrapped up in all of these rules that make it, frankly, limiting and too difficult for many students, especially those who are not maybe at the same level of music literacy as somebody might be in a university program. Again, just to drive this home, here is again the same progression that we've taken through all these variations. And now we've added a melody and we've written it for the violin. So in the end, if a student were to take something like this and come up or take an assignment like this and create this in the end, this is a song, this is a piece, this is a composition that they can say that they wrote. But we got there in a much simpler way that's much more useful to them than worrying about how is the soprano moving? How is the alto moving? Are they following the rules? Are they breaking the rules? Because none of those things are really relevant. And of course, for people who are a little more traditional, you can take this set of techniques and then transition into four-part writing if that's something that you would be interested in teaching your students. The benefits of this is students have spent this time kind of examining how harmonies progress, sort of in a big picture way, before moving on to the next. So if they then have to face the task of following these old, difficult, traditional rules, they have some sense of what it means for a voice to move, what it means to lead a voice through a harmonic progression. So if they want to make it more complicated, they can do that, rather than what typically happens in a theory class where we teach them all the structures and then just throw them into four-part writing and hope that they survive somehow. So to sort of wrap up my portion of things, what's really been the point of all this? The point has been making music more accessible to people and making music making more accessible. We've simplified the process of writing harmonies so that anyone can do it, even if they are not the most advanced theory student. And we've also built some skills on the keyboard so that it can be more accessible like a guitar might. To use the example of learning a language, anybody can formally study a language in a classroom, but really, it only really starts to come together when you're doing it, when you're speaking that language around people who also speak that language. If that's the case, then four-part writing in its traditional sense, we never really get to do it or use it because it's challenging to play on the keyboard, and rarely do you have a whole choir of people in your theory class that can sing things. So using keyboard style instead allows people to do it in real time, hear what it sounds like, feel what it feels like, and see what it looks like so that they can understand what it is that they're trying to do. And I'd like to conclude all of this by saying I think that anything I've just shown you can also be learned without using notation at all. I think you can teach people theory using a keyboard and writing out the letter names using alphabet letters rather than having to know notation, because you can still drive home all of the same points. I do think notation is helpful to record information, but not every student you'll encounter is going to know how to read notation. So we want to have a method that can be used for those students, because again, we want this to be accessible. And in my perfect world, I'd envision a theory sequence that would include all of these building blocks we've talked about: scales, keys, chords, pop chord symbols, but then moves away from this four-part harmony thing that we're talking about so that we can focus on this sort of modified form of teaching harmony so that people can understand what it is that they're trying to write and trying to hear. And yeah, I'd love to take some questions now if anybody has any.
Thank you, Scott. That's been a really wonderful session because you've really simplified and broken down the rules of the voice leading. This is, I think, one of the most complicated topics that theory teachers end up teaching. And you rightly started that it can be really overwhelming for students who are, coming from not so theoretical background. And often theory is kind of taught in a very isolated way, and it's not applied very practically. So I have a couple of questions. One is, do you have any more tips for eliminating rules and simplifying theory?
I really think that if you can rely on what you already know and figure out a way to use that to your advantage. My example again is, of course, playing for dance classes, where I I did the bare minimum to get through piano class when I was in college. So if you give me piano sheet music, it takes me a very long time to learn it and to read it. But if you give me a lead sheet with chords, I can play those chords right away and I can make something up. And so for me, that's kind of when I started thinking, wait a minute, maybe there's a better way to teach theory. Maybe there's another way to do it. So I really think it's about figuring out what you already know and how you can apply that, because again, then you're going to have a better understanding of it on your own just from doing it.
Right. Also, you spoke about the theory one and you defined certain topics that you teach as part of your theory one. Is that sufficient knowledge for a student who is planning to enter into a college, or does he need to know a lot more than that? Because we don't have any degree courses in India, so we don't really know how to prepare for an entry to a college. So, would that be sufficient, or what is your opinion on that?
I actually think that you don't necessarily even need to know those things, because in my experience, all I did when I was pre-college was I played clarinet in band at school, and that was it. So I could read music and I knew key signatures because I had to know them to play, but I didn't know anything about chords. I didn't really know that much about, I knew how to play scales, but I didn't know like what that means. So I think, I think it's entirely possible to enter into a college program without any theory background at all. That's actually very common for, at least in the United States, for vocalists, because vocalists tend not to learn to read music. So they walk into that theory class and we start in that first semester with like, okay, here are the 5 lines. Here are the note names that go on those 5 lines.
Right.
Hopefully that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Really encouraging to know that we don't really need to do theory before entering a college. But the floor is open. If anybody has any questions to ask, I can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. In the meantime, I'll post one more question to you, Scott. Can you talk a little more about vocal drift? It's a new term to our ears, really.
So when I started teaching this to people to use the keyboard and to put the 3 voices together in the right hand, I stuck with an even more limited set of rules on how to move. And I found that the students would follow the rules, but as they would follow the rules, the chords would start to creep up more and more and more, or down more and more and more. And I had to figure out a way, okay, I want to keep this simple, but we have to figure out a way to avoid this. So that's where I fell back a little bit more on the root position part writing skill set, because that allows you to kind of continuously redirect where the chords are going. And I think that was best illustrated by how the hands are often moving in opposition to each other. So if they're often moving in opposition, then you're constantly redirecting that one hand so those voices aren't drifting up into the stratosphere.
Does anybody have any questions? I can just ask everyone to unmute. You don't have to unmute if you don't have a question, but you're free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you like. It was a very complicated topic to discuss, no doubt. I'm not surprised not many people are coming up with questions to ask you. Kind of stumped everybody here. So I think Scott, it'll be really fantastic if we can figure out, because obviously this is a lot of knowledge crammed up into a very small, short session. So this is too much to grasp. I think it'll be really amazing if we can have you back for maybe a longer series of workshops where you can break down these concepts with our participants over longer time, so they can really have time to absorb each of these concepts and put it to their to use and to their music and all those things. So we will be in touch for that. Anybody has any questions to ask? Last call. Right. Well, in that case, I would like to thank you, Scott, and Natalie is going to say the closing words. But we are very thankful to Australian Institute of Music for, supporting us, being the associate sponsor. And we are setting up 3 workshops with Australian Institute of Music in the month of January. This will be on contemporary performance, and the second will be on classical performance, and third will be on music production and composition. So please, the details will be available on our website. These are going to be paid ones, and these are going to be limited seats. A lot of workshops coming up. We have a strings workshop coming up in February. We have a jazz piano improvisation coming up in the month of February. All these details will be up on our website by next week. So these are all paid, only 30 seats for each workshop. So limited seats. So do sign up early for these ones. So thank you so much. Natalie, over to you. You're on mute, Natalie. Can't hear you. You're mute and live on YouTube. Can you figure out? Mic not working. Fair enough. Thank you so much for being online, everyone. I'm putting words into Natalie's mouth, really. So thank you so much for being online, and we'll see you guys tomorrow for yet another session. Tomorrow is a fantastic session with Tim Palmer from the Trinity Laban Conservatory of Music, and it will be about professionalizing music education. It's going to be a fantastic lecture because he has been visiting India since 2013 and is well aware of the teaching conditions and the quality of music teaching that goes about in India, and there will be some fantastic tips to improve that as well. Thank you, Scott, so much for a fantastic session. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope our audience did too. Thank you so much. We'll see you on next week, next session tomorrow. Bye.